Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much Asia Society for hosting us and creating this empowering space. I'm Alice, like introduced, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Anise Health. Anise is the first culturally responsive mental health platform for the Asian community. We offer one-on-one therapy that's covered by insurance, as well as group-based executive coaching. So, what a turnout today. I was told over 300 people signed up. People are tuning in from online. It really goes to show that this topic of authentic leadership is resonating really strongly within our community right now. And also look at the two of us, right? Two young female leaders sitting here in front of you talking to you about leadership. I think that's a lot of progress. And for me, talking about authentic leadership, how we can show up authentically as leaders is such a privilege because a lot of us are really the first generation of Asian Americans with a meaningful seat at the table. Most of our parents and grandparents were immigrants who worked really hard, kept their head down so that we could have the opportunities that are afforded to us right now. At the same time, that brings challenges because they didn't exactly leave us with a playbook on how to lead authentically. And that's one of the reasons that I started Anise Health, is because I believe that looking inward is the key to unlocking our leadership potential. And therapy and coaching are just great tools for doing that.
The next slide.
Yeah, well, before I move on, I want to give Israa also an opportunity to introduce herself.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Welcome, everybody. I personally love the Asia Society, and I come to a lot of their programming here, so I'm very excited to be on this side and not on that side. Thank you for being interested in this topic and also supporting the programming they do here. Like mentioned before, my name is Israa. I'm a therapist. At Anise, I do clinical strategy and operations. I create digital content on Instagram under Well Guide, and I just published my first book called Toxic Productivity, and it does dive into these concepts of authentic leadership, being true to yourselves. Thank you for that. And really leaning into your values so that you can not only just be people who are doing work, you can actually be inspiring and empowering leaders, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So leadership really starts from self-awareness and self-comfort. But for some of us Asian Americans, that doesn't come naturally. Our collectivistic cultures have told us to prioritize the needs of others, whether that be our family or communities before our own. And we weren't very often asked, what do you want, right? And there's also the topic of code switching. We've had to mask parts of ourselves depending on whether we were at home or at school, at work. So it's no wonder that the concept of self-comfort can feel very elusive, which is why we're so excited to be here and have this conversation. And this is how we've structured our presentation today. We'll go over all of these topics. Israa is not only a psychotherapist, but also an expert leadership coach. So she'll be going over some of the concepts as well as providing practical tips. And I'll be complementing that with my personal stories. And we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So definitely jot down your questions or thoughts as we go. So before diving in, I also want to get a temperature of the room. So bear with me. Raise your hand if you are in a leadership position right now. Okay, that's about half of you. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you feel confident about your leadership abilities. Okay, good. I see some hands, maybe a third of you. Raise your hand if you think that you've experienced your Asian identity impact the way that you're perceived as leaders. Okay, I see a third of you. Great. So we see that a lot of you here wanting to build on your leadership experiences, and you've also felt this intersection of your Asian identity and your leadership, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Yes. So I want to, set the stage first. So, the word authentic is used a lot. And when something gets used a lot, it loses its meaning. So I want to start off by talking a little about what authentic leadership actually is, how to embody it. And then I want to talk about also what the alternative is, which is performative leadership. And if you've never heard the phrase, you've definitely experienced it on the receiving end, for sure, because a lot of people will tap into performative leadership because they don't really know how to harness the power of authentic leadership. Before we go into that, I do want to talk a little about why authentic leadership is important. From a psychological perspective, authenticity is the trait that creates emotional safety. Now, when we think about the workplace, we don't really think about emotional safety. But the truth is, and research has shown, that when people feel emotionally safe in an environment, their well-being is better. And when your well-being is better, you show up more productively at work. You show up more comfortably at work. You actually show up at work. Right now, if you are in a leadership position, you know that workplaces are struggling with quiet quitting, people really having this thing called presenteeism, which is you show up at work, but you're not actually engaged or present mentally. So you're just physically there, you're clicking. And then there's absenteeism. People, get sick, they take sick days, or they just don't come to work because it's not a good environment. So when I think about authentic leadership, for leaders specifically, I think it's one of the most core elements of running a successful corporation, business, organization, because it does ultimately impact your bottom line. The alternative, which is performative leadership, is going to give you results in the short term because it is doing all the things. It's checking all the marks of getting the things done, meeting the metrics, meeting your outcomes. All of that number data-driven stuff is happening. So in the short term, you do get an impact, a benefit from performative leadership. But in the long term, it creates an environment of mistrust. It creates a very disengaged environment. It creates a very resentful workforce. And I'll be the first one to say this. It's something that I have experienced as well, where I've worked in places before feeling very disconnected, feeling like I don't really want to give it my all. But then I've also worked at places where my managers had a lot of authenticity, and it gave me an internal drive to work well for them, with them. So the three core tenets of authentic leadership are self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and trust. So these are like the roots of what an authentic leader is, and it can show up and it can look in different, it can look differently, right? But at the core, these are the three things. So why is self-awareness important to be an authentic leader? The biggest thing that I see is if you don't know what you stand for, if you don't know what your values are, if you don't know what your productivity habits are, if you don't know what sets you off, what triggers you, what makes you angry, how you feel when you're angry, how do you communicate that? If you don't know these things, that confusion will become projected onto other people. If you don't know how you're feeling, you're going to project that confusion onto your team member. If you don't know how to process anger, you're going to project it to your subordinates, people who work with you, right? And that creates this environment that is not healthy for anybody. And we spend almost 8 to 10 hours a day at work. And at some point in the pandemic, we thought it would change, but it didn't. And we're kind of back to pre-pandemic levels of working, right? And so self-awareness is not only the cornerstone of being a healthy human being. As a therapist, I can tell you that. That's predominantly the work I do with people when they come to therapy, is improve their own self-awareness. But it also makes you a better leader, it makes you a better team member, and it also is very good for an organization. The second one is emotional intelligence. How many people here have heard this phrase? Lots of books, yeah. There's a lot of, HBR has this whole series on emotional intelligence. And I think emotional intelligence is hugely underrated in the workforce. And that's because when we think about emotional intelligence within a workplace environment, we're kind of thinking of very tactical skills. But the foundation of emotional intelligence is emotional regulation. So what I mean by that is understanding, identifying, and managing difficult emotions is the cornerstone of being an emotionally intelligent person. And that goes back to self-awareness. So these three are not discrete, but they're definitely important verticals of authenticity. Because if you know what your emotions are, and you know when you're going to get activated by something, and you know that you can push through it, you can manage it, you can process it well, then other people will start to trust you because you're going to trust yourself. If you think back to being in high school is the most emotionally confusing time of everyone's life, right? If you think back to high school, you might have memories of not being able to trust yourself because you did not know how you were going to react in different situations, because you just didn't know your emotions because you were a young person, right? But as we grow older and we come into these leadership positions, we become very tactical. We want to learn the VLOOKUP on an Excel, and we want to learn how to make presentations. We want to know how to stand in a room and speak to people, but we don't build the skill of understanding and regulating our emotions. So if you want to be an emotionally intelligent individual because you want to be an authentic leader, you have to first come back to yourself and understand your emotions. Because the second thing that happens when you regulate your emotions well is that you become an empathetic person. You start to see the perspectives of other people, which makes you more dynamic. So when a problem comes to your table in a team, if you have a lot of empathy, you know how to tap into different perspectives. And so you become a better problem solver. You become more creative because you are harnessing the power of your emotions. And the third thing that is like a hallmark of authentic leadership is trust and transparency. So this means taking accountability for the mistakes that you've made, right? Being very open with people in the things that you are not that good at, even if you're a leader. You know, some of the most powerful leaders are the people who can identify what is not working for them, what they're not good at, and there's no shame in that. Trust and transparency also means being very clear about expectations. You know, we've all at some point in our entire lives worked for people, whether it was your high school job, at a coffee shop, or maybe where you are right now. We've had managers who are not clear about their expectations from us. And so we inevitably don't meet them, and there's some kind of misalignment. But trust and transparency leads you to having very clear expectations. And you, as you grow into your career, can also use that skill in order to be very organized so that you meet your deadlines, because you can be clear about your expectations as well. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little about performative leadership. And I talked about that a little bit earlier, so I'll kind of go through this here. Performative leadership is just the mechanics of being a leader. So you're meeting deadlines, you're making the agendas, you're talking in a meeting, and you're doing all the things, but you're just projecting that image. You're doing it because you want people to see you a certain way, instead of actually tapping into the empathy and the self-awareness and the transparency. And like I said before, it's a short-term thing. It'll get you the thing you want right now, but it's not a sustainable way of building leadership skills.
Yeah. So we've learned these concepts, but in practice, how can leaders balance the need to assert our authority and seem confident in a room while staying approachable and authentic?
This is a very challenging thing that we have to build over time. I don't think anyone ever, commands a room. Balancing authenticity and, being a very confident leader right from the get-go. It's a practice that you have to build in small ways, exposing yourself to situations where you're speaking, you're meeting people, and you're practicing those skills. And the three things that I want to talk about here when it comes to commanding a room, so that you can balance being authentic and being a leader, is what I mentioned earlier, which is vulnerability. If you can come in presence of other people and display honest vulnerability, then people will immediately get comfortable in front of you and they will trust you, and then they will give you their attention, right? And so a really good way to practice vulnerability is to own the things that you don't know how to do, but come with a solution. So if somebody asks you something in a meeting, instead of BSing your way through it, because people will pick that up and then they will not trust you, say something that is similar to, you know what, I actually don't know this, but I do know someone who does. Let me find out and get back to you. Immediately, you have made yourself vulnerable so they can trust you, but you also came with a solution, not just a problem. So they can trust you. So you're building this compounded trust. That is a really great way to command presence. The second one I'll talk about is approaching your mistakes and failures from a growth perspective. So mistakes happen, life is complicated. I mean, even coming here, my train was delayed. I didn't plan the time well, and I was like a few minutes late. That happens, but you have to take that as a learning opportunity instead of really berating yourself. And I mean, I'm a child of immigrants, I'm Asian. I know how hard that is because our parents don't allow that for us, right? And that's okay, that's who they were. And we get to rewrite our stories just by being here and learning this. So the second one is really approaching your mistakes and your failures from a growth mindset. And the third one is taking ownership for your actions. A lot of Asian diaspora folks grow up in homes that are very black and white when it comes to whose fault it was, right? It's very, you did this, you did it wrong, this is your fault. And so we also internalize that, and then we bring it to the workplace. And something goes wrong, and we're like, no, this was their fault, or this is all my fault. And what that does is it creates a very mistrusting environment. And so being able to take ownership and accountability of what your piece is and what the other person's piece is in a constructive way will really help people see you as a presence that they need to pay attention to. However, that being said, I briefly touched on this cultural aspect that we have, right? And the three things that I just picked to talk about today that I mentioned earlier are related to our cultural background, right? And of course, the AAPI community is not a monolith. We don't all have the same parents, but the cultural research has shown that there are some trends. There are some parenting trends, there are some family dynamics, and there's some beautiful things about our collectivist culture. However, sometimes those things can come into confrontation. Ooh, did you hear that? Oh, that was me. That was the clicker. Sorry about that. That was a mistake, I'll own it. That was my hand. Sometimes those things can come into confrontation with the predominant Western work values. Has anybody experienced that? Where you're like, maybe I shouldn't do this. This feels so different from my culture. I'll just share a very quick, funny anecdote. So in my culture, I'm Pakistani, we don't take older adult people's first names. Like that's just never, there's so many aunts and uncles of mine, I learned their names when I became an adult myself. When I first started working, it was very hard for me to take the first name of my coworkers who were like my mom's age. I really struggled with that internally. And what that did is it prevented me from speaking up in meetings because I got awkward. Even if I had something really good to say, I just would say it afterwards or I'd send it as an email because I was having that hesitation just opening my mouth and saying something. And it's something I had never thought about before. And when I really started struggling with it is when I realized that I'm not accustomed to saying the first name of people who are older than me. And I had to work on changing that. So sometimes the things are really beautiful about our culture, but they do have to change in the work environment. It doesn't mean you have to change it outside of the work environment if you don't want to. I still don't take older people's first name outside of the workplace, but I do it when I'm working. And so I just wanted to share that example as to how sometimes things don't have to be a bad thing in our culture for us to just shift the mindset a little bit in the workplace. So a couple of things about the cultural stuff that I wanted to talk about that I'm kind of blanking on right now because of my story that was off script. The three I'm going to talk about are probably things everyone has experienced at some point. The first one is a sense of false humility. So Asian diaspora folks here, a lot of Asian families, we operate under a false humility. So what is a false humility? A false humility is when you are kind of passively sharing information about the good things in your life, but you can never be very direct about your achievements. You can never really be direct about accepting a compliment Or how many times do, in your families, older adults give you money because you did something well, and your parents are like, no, 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 give it back. Now this back and forth is happening, right? It's because we operate under this sense of false humility, that we have to be humble no matter what. And while that is a beautiful thing in a collectivist culture, right, because it keeps us together, in the workplace, it might show up as you not being able to share your wins, or you being very uncomfortable taking compliments, or even telling your manager that you excelled at something. And so what that does is it lowers your visibility in a workplace, even if you are excelling. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the second one I want to talk about is the self-rejecting mindset. So a lot of us, grow up in a scarcity mindset. Keep your head down, get your work done, just make it to the next milestone, and do not ruffle any feathers because you're not ready for it. So many of us, and predominantly my clients are young Asian Americans, and one of the things I hear a lot is, oh, I'm not ready yet for this. I'll apply to the promotion next year. Not ready, not yet, not me. So we often self-reject ourselves out of the running. We don't even apply, we don't put our names down, we don't raise our hand because we always feel like there's more to be done to make us more competent, right? And that is an offshoot of some of our parenting dynamics. It's an offshoot of cultural dynamics as well. Or it could just be like your family culture. If you come from a very overachieving family, nothing will ever feel like it's good enough. Yeah, thank you. If you come from a really overachieving family, like you will feel like nothing is good enough. What is happening?
We'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll just press it. Are you guys hearing that? Or you are, okay. It's like, I just don't know what's happening between this. What was I saying? Yes, if you come from a very overachieving family, you are more likely to feel like you'll never be ready for the next thing. And finally, there is a little bit of identity confusion when it comes to coming from an Eastern collectivist culture and living in an individualistic Western society. Even if you were born here, a lot of us, we open the doors and we leave our homes, like our parents' homes, and we have to code switch. We have to become other people. And then we go back home and then we become other people in there. And it's not necessarily a bad thing all the time. What it does is it fragments your identity a little bit. So now you kind of don't know who you are. And especially if you're an early career professional, that is extremely confusing. And so you might go into a workplace and you'll see leaders exhibiting all of these characteristics that you have been taught to not do. You have been taught never to boast about yourself, but those are the people who are getting promoted at work. So then how do you reconcile that? How do you bring it together? It becomes very confusing. And what I notice is a lot of people will overcorrect. They will shed every cultural learning and then completely go to the other side and become boastful and arrogant and the loudest voice in the room. And that's not helpful either, right? That doesn't make you a pleasant person to work with. So we have to find balance when it comes to these cultural barriers. And so I want to switch gears and hear from Alice some of her experiences as, building and running a company herself as an Asian American leader.
Yeah. So much of what you said resonated. I saw a lot of nodding heads in the audience. For me, as a 1.5 gen Chinese Canadian, culture shows up in every aspect of my life, including the work that I do. I think it exists both externally as structural barriers. For example, early on in our journey, founding Anise, we entered a global startup pitch competition. And despite very clearly presenting our target demographic and value prop, we got questions from the judges that were blatantly biased. Like, if Asian Americans are struggling with their mental health in the US, why don't they go back to Asia? Or that there is no demand for our services because Asian countries are managing their mental health fine. We even got the suggestion to go serve the Chinese military, which fundamentally misses the point of our solution. Despite this, we approached the judges with an attitude of curiosity, stayed poised, and we were actually the only startup founded by female founders to be selected as one of the finalists out of over 400 that applied, let alone female of color. But it was really obvious that the judges there connected so much more to the white guys who were pitching another hard seltzer brand. So
who doesn't need that? Who doesn't need a 100th hard seltzer?
Another seltzer brand, we all need that. So sometimes it's like true barriers that exist because of our race. But I've also found culture to show up in my ability to lead. So another example is during fundraising. Before I went out to pitch to investors, I did a practice run with my existing investor. And the feedback that I got was, Alice, you sound a lot more conservative compared to other founders that pitched to me. And pointing out the fact that my pitch was the first deck he's seen, a first seed company that has EBITDA in their financial projection. And this really threw me off. And I had to do a lot of reflection because my investor is on my team. He also identified, he's also Asian American. And so it wasn't out of bias or out of any malicious intention. And I did a lot of work reflecting with my therapist and coach and realized that it had a lot to do with the way that I was raised because my immigrant parents were often focused on the worst case scenario and talked about contingency planning, right? Mitigating your downside risk. So I carried that into my pitch as well and was really focused on protecting the downside. And having this realization let me reframe, and I actually started thinking about, okay, what if everything lined up and went well? What could be the best that Anise can be? And I didn't want to just throw out idea just to sound really bullish to be the next unicorn. But I landed on, okay, Anise can really expand to Asia because I personally lived in Asia. I have network there, and I know there's so much demand for mental health in Asian countries. And that allowed me to then find an investor with connection to Taiwanese family office. But this is just an example of how our cultural roots can serve as barriers, but also strengths. And doing that self-reflection can be tremendously helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. When you first shared the story with me, that was the first thing that came to my mind is you shifted from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. But if you're not accustomed to abundance mindset, it feels silly. It feels like you're being irresponsible because so many of us are constantly contingency planning, being responsible. And this is a really great example of how sometimes our cultural habits, we can think that they are so beneficial to us everywhere. And what it requires is for us to think through where it is helpful and where it's not helpful. So thank you for sharing that. So, I've talked and she's talked for like 30 minutes now, and it's all been really abstract, but I do want to do in this last section, give you a few tangible things that are directly related to some of the cultural concepts that I was talking about before. And if you already do this, find a way to see how you can enhance the skill a little bit more. If you don't do this, or if this is the first time you're hearing it, don't be overwhelmed by it. Just pick the smallest way you could do this, right? Because I think that it doesn't matter where you are in your company, whether you're a leader or not, every single person has leadership in them. You don't need to be leading a team of 50 in order to be a leader. You can be a leader just within your own cohort. So think about this. So I talked about false humility, right? It's very hard for us to talk about the things we're good at. So how can you do that in a comfortable way so that you get visibility in the workplace? And you can do that by using I statements that are structured in a way that connect your effort to the broader effort of the team or the goal. Because then you're not just saying, hey, look at me, it's just me, I did so well, but you can actually connect it to a specific goal that your team or your project or your company is trying to reach. And instead of centering yourself in it, make yourself a part of reaching that goal. Because that's gonna make you feel more comfortable in talking about your role within getting that whole thing completed. And so saying things like, I completed the report that was in the presentation for X thing, right? Just structuring the visibility so that it is connected to a broader issue will make you more comfortable. Over time, you will get comfortable just taking ownership of your achievements and your successes and your wins because you deserve it, especially if you're working hard. But if you're not in the habit of doing it, making that jump is inaccessible. It's just too challenging. And so doing it in this way softens the awkwardness for you. Because usually you're the only person who's feeling awkward about sharing your achievements. Other people want to support you. They want you to do well, right? They see that you work hard, but you're the person who feels awkward, because that has happened with me as well. The second one I want to talk about is related to the identity confusion about what type of leader should I be when I have these two sets of values that seem like they're in conflict. And for that, I think it's really important for everybody to have their own mission statement when it comes to leadership. Whether you're in a leadership position or not, like I said, it doesn't matter. You need to have some core values that are non-negotiables for you, that are reflected in your behavior, in your team work, in how you relate to your colleagues. So for that, I would say sit down and think about two values that are absolutely critical to you as a leader, that you want to embody in your behaviors. It can be accountability, it can be, punctuality, it can be responsiveness and communication, it can be so many things. But think about two things that can become your defining characteristic, because over time, that's going to build your leadership philosophy. And, there's a lot of prompts out there in the world. Like if you just Google it, you'll find some that can help you build a leadership philosophy, or you can reach out to us after and we can help you figure that out as well. But I also wanted to kind of hear from you, Alice, around this.
Some practical tips.
Yeah.
These are all great skills that I've practiced personally. I think now I approach developing leadership skills the same way that I approach company building, which is iteratively and based on feedback. And I really started taking feedback in a slightly different way than I used to. Before, I would be really focused on the areas of improvement, right? Just feeling like constantly I'm being evaluated and maybe falling short on something. But I realized that there's just as much value in focusing on what people perceive to be my strengths and what people appreciate about me and what I bring to the table than it is to focus on where I'm falling short. And focusing on that has allowed me to hone in on my strengths, build on that, and take the feedback less personally also. Yeah. I think the other thing that I've noticed me doing something differently is also paying attention to how some of the cultural aspects, our backgrounds and values show up in my teammate. So being a mental health platform for the Asian community, we're still a small team and we tend to attract those that are very mission aligned. So our team is predominantly Asian American. And I was interviewing someone, Asian American female, who shared with me during the interview that she had gotten burnt out from her previous work because the scope had gotten too big. And she was also managing people, but she was given the feedback that she needed to be more stern with her team. When I heard this, instead of kind of taking that as her leadership skills are lacking or she's unable to handle workload, I went into, does her culture have anything to do with it? So we started talking about how that might be showing up, and she acknowledged that her kind of conflict avoidance based on her family dynamic, not being someone who would talk back to her parents, really affected the way that she showed up at work and managed a team, especially with a team she was managing, which was predominantly white male. So upon hearing this, instead of writing her off as someone who's incapable, I thought she was very coachable. And so while working together, I give her tips. I also encourage her to set boundaries and communicate what's working and what's not working with me.
I really love that because that is a really powerful display of emotionally intelligent leadership, because you're taking someone's situation, adding some context to it, and making it a constructive experience as opposed to a punitive experience, which is what happens in performative leadership. Because performative leadership, like I said, is very much concerned with the technical aspect, and it does not contextualize the person at all. So I really like this. So thank you for sharing that. In the last few minutes, I just want to turn to something that is really important, which is self-advocacy. Research has shown that, and I mean, I'm not going to quote the research, I'm going to quote a very common phrase, which is, it's not always about what you know, it's about who you know, right? And self-advocacy gives you visibility. And because we have a lot of barriers culturally that are systemic, right? And then of course, our own cultural stuff that we're bringing, a lot of times there's this big gap between executive leadership and Asian workers, right? They're not that well represented. A lot of Asian workers in the US are kind of like mid-ish. There's this common stereotype that, Asian people make better worker bees and they can't manage people. There's a lot of these like tropes about Asian folks. And so how do we bridge that gap? We could rail against the system and want to change it. That's super important as well. We could also do it from ourselves, change some of the habits, become aware of the habits that are holding us back. So self-advocacy is a really important way of making sure that you are seen, that you are heard, and that you are validated for your efforts. It is a way to make sure that people see you, and not just like in an emotional way, but actually in a practical, tactical, tangible way. And so self-advocacy is very challenging, especially if you're not used to it. And also it does feel weird sometimes, I'll be honest. But if you practice certain things and you practice them well enough, it stops feeling that weird over time. So I'll share two that have really helped me. I transitioned from being a full-time clinician to working in digital health. And just the work environment is so different at a tech startup versus, working at a clinic. It's just a different world. And so I really had to learn these things very fast in the first year. This is years ago. And so I really love these two things that I'm going to share. One helped me a lot, and I did that with my own career coach, if you will. This is about 6-7 years ago, is I made an elevator pitch for myself. And an elevator pitch is a very small thing that you learn to say in different ways that highlights your strengths, your interests, your connection to the broader mission of a company and who you are. Something that's memorable about you, so that the person you spoke with remembers you. Because sometimes you might meet like somebody who's in executive leadership for like a 2-minute conversation in an elevator. And that's the only time you'll ever see this person. And there's like 4 layers between you and them. How are you going to get noticed? By having a really great elevator pitch. And it took me almost 6 or 7 months to get it down right. Because the first version is kind of like a car salesman-y vibe, right? The second one is too long. And then you have to keep doing it and refining it until it feels like you're just naturally speaking. It needs to sound like something that you just say. So I would really encourage you to think through how you can craft an elevator pitch for yourself. The first draft is going to be hideous. Don't judge yourself. Continue doing it over and over again. Give yourself like Q1 next year. By March, you should have an elevator pitch that is in good second draft, and then spend some more time on it. It is really transformative because it gives somebody something to remember you by. And that's what matters a lot. The second one I want to talk about is find your voice in meetings. So I shared an experience earlier where I had a hard time speaking up in meetings very early on in my career because of my own stuff. And I decided, once I realized that, I would commit to speaking up once meaningfully per meeting, no matter what. And so that meant I became more engaged in meetings. I was more connected. It pushed me out of just the meeting and thinking about the organization as a whole, so that I could contribute something. It made me more engaged with other people who were coming to the meeting, so I could say something that was meaningful to them, because I was really holding myself accountable, that I had to say something in a meeting, but it also had to be meaningful. You can't just say, oh, no questions from me, that doesn't count. So commit to speaking up in a meeting until you find your own voice. That will give you visibility, it will give you more interest, it will make you more engaged, and again, it will make you memorable. These are two very tangible, small ways you can kind of get started on self-advocacy. And I know Alice has a really good one to share, so I'd love for you to share it.
Well, before that, Israa, I'd love to hear your elevator pitch, putting you on the spot so everyone can hear an example.
My elevator pitch is, hi, I'm Israa. I'm very interested in education. I love educating people. I love learning from them as well. And then I'll go into the thing that the person is talking about. So you have to just craft like a mission. My mission really is education. I'm not a teacher, but I educate people in mental health. I educate people through content, through writing, through speaking. And you can't educate if you don't learn. So a lot of times people remember me as an educator because there's so many therapists in the world. But when you
had one about your global background, right? When you were working in corporate.
Oh yeah. Okay, so as you move through your career and different stages, your elevator pitch will change as to what you're doing. But remind me about that one. I'm forgetting that. Is that like the one about the global citizen?
Yes.
Oh yes.
I love that one.
Yes. Okay, so thank you. So this one is if the person I know is kind of interested in diversity, so you have to kind of cater it, right? You have to be a little strategic, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I'm kind of going in for like a diversity angle, I will amp up my own diversity. So I'll start off by immediately saying, I'm Israa, I'm an educator, I'm interested in mental health. Somehow I'll quickly weave in that I grew up in Saudi Arabia. And immediately the person will stop and they want to listen. Because for better or for worse, in the United States, that is very interesting to people. And and I picked this up very early on. And so I'll kind of slip that in there, and then I'll quickly slip in that I'm actually Pakistani. I grew up in the Middle East, moved to Toronto. I'll just kind of create this story about myself very quickly that shows that I am a global citizen, that I have a lot of diverse perspectives. If I'm really feeling spicy, I'll sprinkle in that I'm Muslim, right? And then all of it makes it very interesting to the person. And so now I've actually given them reason to believe that I know a lot about diversity. I've lived in many different countries. I understand different perspectives. I know different cultures. I'm a third culture kid. And so that immediately sets me apart. Right? And so thank you for reminding me of that one.
So your bosses can keep you in mind next time there's an international project and you become very memorable.
Exactly. International project, or if there is something to do with like a diverse initiative, right? Or if there's anything, like they'll be like, oh, wait, remember that girl who grew up in Saudi Arabia? Let's bring her in. And so it's finding these things about you that maybe your high school version was ashamed of, and making it like a strength for you right now. Can be really fun. It can be a fun way of talking about yourself. So thank you for that. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Alice to talk about something before we move into the Q&A portion.
Yeah, I want to move into the Q&A. I'm sure you guys have a lot to ask Israa or myself. But before that, I want to just close with how exciting of a time we're in right now. I don't know about you, but I definitely feel the tides changing in the Asian community, starting with places like these, Asia Society. There's a ton more other organizations that are bringing all of us together, united by our collective experience, backgrounds, our ambitions, and uplifting each other. And it's really encouraging to see that as of 2022, or 2023, actually, there were 50 Asian American CEOs out of the Fortune 500 companies, which more than 2.5x since the previous year. And in the past 2 decades, there were more than a quarter of billion-dollar startups that were founded by Asian American co-founders. Yeah. So all of us here are in this trailblazing territory where we have this opportunity to carve out a leadership position for ourselves and grow into the leaders that we want to be. So we never like leaving you empty-handed after having a conversation like this. This is not something that we can conclude in 60 minutes. So if you want to continue the work or continue the conversation, we offer a group-based executive coaching program. It's a 6-week program. You're with a cohort of others in a similar career trajectory and level as you, led by expert executive coaches to work through these topics, exactly like self-advocacy, executive presence, knowing your own vision and mission statement. So if you're interested, talk to me after. You can scan the QR code to sign up. So with that, we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yes. Do we have any questions? Yes.
So one of my questions is about elevators. So I've heard a lot of people talk about them, but in particular, I feel like my barrier is often like saying hi or doing something because a lot of us, especially in New York, tend to just kind of keep our heads down. So how do you go about even just breaking the ice to say hello? Oh, sorry.
I'll just repeat the question. How do you break the ice for an elevator pitch, just to say hello, to kind of make it not awkward, I assume, or for yourself? So this is something I do, and anything I ever recommend, like, please do it if you feel comfortable. But something that I do is I find one thing to compliment the person on. Again, you want to be genuine. Don't just say something that sounds insincere, but find one thing about them that feels like it's a natural opener. Oh, I really like your scarf, or oh, is it like whatever bag, or whatever the situation is, right? Like last night I went to an event on my own and there was a woman sitting next to me and she was painting an olive. It was like a painting class. And I was on my own, so I wanted to make conversation. And I just said to her, I was like, oh my gosh, your olive is so cute. And then we ended up just talking just about everything else. So I think that's a thing. And I think you have to be very clear and quick when you do it. Especially in a city like New York, people don't have time. So you just want to be like, hi, just want to say your scarf was really nice, or you were so great at that presentation last week, if this is a workplace, right? And then just quickly go into it. My name is, and then just start.
Yeah, and I think an elevator pitch doesn't literally mean that you're in the elevator and pitching someone, because if they're running off to places in a hurry, then that's not a good time to catch them. So you want to kind of be in the right environment. And I also think that you can practice with others that are in like much lower risk like settings. Like if you go to your coffee shop, talk to the barista, right? And strike a small conversation, small talk, and see how that feels. And I think also it's kind of awkward if you make an eye contact and don't talk, then like that chance is over. Yeah. So if you're in that mood to pitch yourself, first eye contact, just smile and gauge their reaction. If they don't smile back, they're on their phone busy, then it's just not a good time. But if they make the eye contact back, just I think a simple smile can make the other person feel more comfortable and see if the conversation starts organically from there. At least
that's a really good point. Yeah, I like that, for sure. Gauge the temperature. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Devika. My question is, you can either generalize it or answer for yourselves. Like, what are your metrics for success? How do you know you're doing well in your life? Is it if you're peaceful or if you're surrounded by supportive people or personal, professional goals? Like, how do you gauge yourself?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That is the ultimate question of life. You can go first.
Well, first I want to validate that that's a hard question to answer for a lot of people. I think especially for people like us of Asian descent, because we grew up with a lot of shoulds, right? We saw our parents sacrifice so much, but that also came with so much expectations around our achievement. And our culture values, honoring our parents, filial piety, so we don't want to let them down. And I've personally struggled with this tension all my life, and I ended up just kind of finding that balance, the middle point that would satisfy both my personal preferences and goals with what would be acceptable for my parents. I won't go into it, but I worked in consulting and finance for a long time that were stable jobs, but I went to Japan because I wanted to work internationally and have more of a dynamic career. So it took me a long time to explore and honestly had to do a lot of work through therapy to find what makes me happy. But I think asking that question about yourself is really the starting point. And ultimately, I realized for myself, the biggest thing that makes me feel fulfilled at work is feeling like I have an impact through the work that I do. You know, people approach work in different ways. Some people just see it as a way to make money and they have their hobbies outside of work, which is completely fine. Other people, you know, use it for other things. But for me, just that impact piece was really important. So that's why I chose this path of building something that I feel has so much impact and I truly believe in the mission of.
Hi, my name is Sonam, and a lot of what you mentioned today really hits home. And I'm going to take the first step and practice self-advocacy by trying to ask something that's relevant. So I oftentimes find myself very inspired when I come to these events, and like I relate to a lot of what you guys mentioned today. And you did bring up therapy and also your accelerator program. But do you have any other like mindful practices that you advise your clients to use to stay accountable? So like among all these different topics that I could work on today, how can I go home and like keep myself accountable on reaching maybe like one or two of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say in order to stay accountable to yourself, you have to start small. So whenever you leave a session like this or a different one, you have to just pick one thing. Just pick one thing and have an idea of committing to it for the next 7 days. Because when we make a commitment for longer than that, and you know it's something that you just kind of saw a little bit or heard a little bit, it's very easy to forget about it, or it becomes uncomfortable, or we don't want to do it, right? So what I say to people when you're starting a new habit, like go 7 days by 7 days. So literally put like an alert in your calendar for the next 7 days that reminds you, or like an alarm that reminds you, work on your elevator pitch for 5 minutes. Let's just say as an example, right? Then you hit that 7 days, go for the next 7 days. I think it's once things become a habit, it's easier to stay accountable. But if you start off something really big and you say, I really want to make my elevator pitch, and then that's it, that's the only goal, like you won't be able to keep yourself accountable because there's no plan, right? Like a goal and a plan are different. And so I would say go 7 days by 7 days and pick one small thing, like the lowest hanging fruit. And then that will also give you this sense of self-confidence and trust that, hey, I actually do hold myself accountable. I did this for 14 days. And then it can actually snowball from there. Yeah.
And I would also add on that it's helpful to also look inward and think about why you want to do the thing that you're trying to do, right? Like, what is your motivation for it? And you know, often when you work with a coach, they walk you through your strengths, weaknesses, what do you foresee as your potential barriers for achieving that goal? And just mapping all of those out in your mind can first inform, is this even something that you really want to work on? Or are you just feeling kind of pressured because it seems like everyone else is doing it? And then from there, you set tactical goals, start small.
Yeah, I like that. That's really important.
Hi, my name is Seki. Thank you for an amazing panel today. I really enjoyed it. Kind of following up and also kind of using what I learned previous, like to never leave a meeting without speaking. So my question is like following up from like earlier, which was like what leader I should be. So let's say you're in a situation where like you have a colleague who's like not in the best well-being at a work environment for various reasons. Like as someone who is also a leader and also a colleague, how can you kind of approach like, and help someone who is also like, in a not good well-being state, like in terms of mental health and all that being, like, how can you help as a colleague and a leader?
That's a very empathetic question. How do you support coworkers who are struggling themselves? I think like that's a little bit of a tricky one in a workplace. You need to have like a pre-existing relationship with them in order to have that conversation. So I'll kind of speak from like the more therapeutic perspective, and then Alice, I would love to hear like as a leader how you think about supporting your team who might be struggling. So if you have a pre-existing relationship with the person, having an honest and empathetic conversation that is not going to highlight or blame any behaviors, but say, hey, I notice you don't seem like yourself. I noticed that you looked a little upset, or, I noticed that something that is not to do with their performance, because people get a little defensive. So saying things like, I'm noticing that you've made a lot of errors or you're coming in late, immediately the person will feel attacked, even if that's not your intention. So starting off softly with a sense of concern and empathy, helping them understand that you're there to support them, and then just listen. Because you might not be in a position to offer any change or help, but sometimes what people really need the most is someone to just listen to them. And it's okay if you don't have solutions either, because validating someone's difficult situation is sometimes that's all you can give, and it's sometimes invaluable.
Yeah, and how we try to take care of our employees' mental health, being a mental health company, is we set check-ins that are periodic. Every 2 weeks, we're doing a team retro where everyone shares what's going well, what's neutral, what's not going well, kind of rosebud thorns, just so that we're, in the loop for how everyone's feeling. We also offer coaching as a benefit to every one of our employees to not just take care of them professionally, but holistically as people.
Hi, I'm Sunil. I have a question about the code switching and the impact of code switching on authenticity. I grew up in a place and at a time where you suppressed our culture, right? You suppress your identity in order to fit in because it wasn't appropriate or wasn't cool or whatever the case may be. And that necessarily impacts your identity in the workplace. And so I'm looking at it from the opposite now, right? How do you actually bring that side of your culture and your identity to the workplace in a way that it can be celebrated and valued and influence and inform the way in which you engage with your colleagues, the way in which you engage with your team? So going, the complete opposite route of where it started necessarily. You spoke a little bit about that in terms of celebrating your diversity and your elevator pitch, but I'm thinking more on like the sort of day-to-day routine where it's not something that's necessarily neglected, but is brought to the fore.
So code switching is a very personal experience for different people, right? And some people have had a very negative experience with it in their life, whereas some people have had just like a neutral, it's just like a fact of life. I do this here, I do that there. So I think knowing that about yourself is the first thing, is what do I actually feel about code switching? Some people don't like it, whereas other people don't have a problem with it as the person who is doing it. And so I feel like the first thing is to understand that. Like, where do you actually fall on that spectrum? Do you have, resentment that you have to code switch? Or do you feel like this is a strength of yours that makes you multifaceted? So kind of parsing that through is the first thing. The second thing I'll say is the intention with which you are code switching. So as you're trying to bring this version of yourself to work now, what is the intention behind it? Is it because it is cool to be Asian now? Is it because, you want to celebrate that? It is a strength that you genuinely believe that you can leverage in the workplace? What is the reason you want to do it? And the reason you want to know your intention is because it helps you translate that into action. If you don't know why you're doing something, you are more likely to take decisions that are not that aligned. Does that respond to your question? Okay. All right.
Yeah, and I would say also know yourself, or everything starts from your own awareness. So think about what are the strengths, cultural strengths that you're bringing into the work. And maybe your intention is that you want to bring more of that by showing more of your cultural roots. And I think our Asian cultures have so many values that are inherently like great leadership qualities, like humility is a great leadership skill, having empathy, listening to your team members, and yeah, really understanding them. And so just knowing those attributes and why you want to bring it, I think can be helpful.
I think we have time for one more, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, one more, and then we'll invite everyone
Yeah.
to continue chatting.
Thank you so much for your insightfulness and sharing and everything. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to share something that had worked for me, and it ties back to this self-awareness and trust, right? And one of the things that I emphasize to the people who report to me is things like lead by example. So even though they're not managers, I want them to lead by example, this invisible leading, right? And we think of leadership as, something above, and then you tell people what to do, but it's actually the opposite of that, like, setting an example really help to gain that trust, I think, So I just wanted to tie just everything back and, thank you.
Thank you for saying that, and I completely agree. True leadership is not about meeting the metrics, it's about inspiring and empowering people to be their best selves. So thank you for sharing that.